In the spring of 1887, in a granite-cut hollow north of Helena, in the Montana Territory, a woman named Cora Mensch paid $11 for a building that 3 men in the room had already decided was worthless. They called it the Quarry Shack, and they were not wrong about its condition. The roof had gone soft on the north pitch. The single window was a hole stuffed with sacking. The walls were dry-laid stone, mortarless, the kind of stacking a man does when he means to keep the wind off and nothing else, and the whole of it leaned a half-foot toward the cut, as if the hill that bore it had grown tired of the weight. The auctioneer read the lot number twice before anyone bid, and when Cora raised her hand, he looked at her the way men looked at a thing that had wandered into the wrong corral. What none of them knew, what Cora herself did not yet fully know, was that the wall she had just bought held something inside it that had been waiting 11 years to be found, and that the small sum she had paid would, before the snow came again, settle a debt no one in that room believed had ever existed. She was 28 years old that spring, and she had arrived in the hollow with a canvas roll of mason's tools, a gray mule named Pellet, and $40 sewn into the hem of her coat. She had not come to the territory for land or for a husband. She had come because a man named Otto Mensch, her father, had died the winter before in a rooming house in St. Louis, and the only thing he left her was the trade he had taught her with his own hands and a single sentence he had said so often it had worn a groove in her memory. Stone remembers how it was set, he told her, when she was small enough to sit on an upturned bucket and watch him work. A wall will tell you who built it, if you learn to read the courses. She had not understood him then. She would understand him entirely before the year was out. The men who laughed at her purchase that morning were not cruel men, only certain ones. There was Harlan Doak, who ran the freight office and held the paper on half the hollow, a heavy man with a soft voice and a way of looking at a thing as if he had already added up what it would cost him. There was a surveyor named Gattis who had come up from the railroad and wore his certainty like a good coat, a transit case under his arm, and a habit of squinting at the hills as though they owed him an answer. And there was the auctioneer, a sweating man named Polk, who told her as he took her $11 that she now owned the only house in the territory that a strong wind would carry off before she could move into it. The room found this very funny. A man near the door said the wall had bought her, not the other way around, and another said she ought to have held out for the goat that came with the next lot, since at least a goat could be made to move. Cora folded her receipt into a square and put it in the satchel at her hip and did not answer because her father had also taught her that the work answers better than the mouth. She had bought it on the strength of a single thing, and she had told no one what it was. While Polk droned through the lot numbers and the men leaned against the rail rolling cigarettes, she had walked out alone to look at the shack before the bidding, the way she looked at everything, with her hands. The others had glanced at it from the track and seen a ruin. Cora had laid her palm against the north wall and felt, under the grime and the lean, the level beds and the broken joints of a master's work running along the bottom courses, and she had stood there a moment longer than made sense to anyone watching, and then she had walked back down and waited for the lot to come up. $11 for a falling-down shack was a fool's price to every man in the room. $11 for a wall built by a man who knew his trade was, she judged, the cheapest thing she had ever bought. I will tell you now, so you are not waiting on it the whole way through, that this is not a story about a gunfight or a wedding. It is a story about a woman, a wall, and the patience it takes to make a buried thing speak. Stay with it. Wall is worth the weight. The quarry shack sat at the foot of an old granite cut that had been worked and abandoned before Cora was born. The company that opened it had taken what it wanted and left the rest, and the rest was a great gray scar in the hillside, terraced and silent, with blocks the size of wagons left half-split where the work had stopped. Spring water ran down through the cut and pooled at its base, and the shack had been built there, she supposed, by some quarryman who wanted to be near the work and the water both. It was a poor place, and it was hers, the first thing in her life that had ever been only hers, and on the morning after the auction she walked Pellet up the rutted track and stood in front of it and began, in the way her father had taught her, to read it. She read it for 3 days before she lifted a single tool. This was the part the men in the hollow would never have understood, and it was the part that mattered most. A careless mason looks at a wall and sees stone. A trained one sees decisions. Cora walked the shack's 3 standing walls and the leaning fourth, and she ran her bare hand along the courses, and she felt where the stacking changed. 2 of the walls were the work of a hurried man, rubble fill and uneven beds, stone laid to be quick rather than true. The north wall, the one that leaned, was different. The lower courses of it had been set by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The beds level, the joints broken properly so that no seam ran straight up through 2 courses, the face plumb where the rest sagged. Someone had built the bottom of that wall to last 100 years. And then, partway up, the careful work stopped, and the same hurried hand that built the other walls had finished it off in rubble, as if the careful builder had been interrupted and never returned. A wall will tell you who built it. 2 men had built this one, and one of them had been stopped. She did not know yet what the change in the courses meant. She only knew the way she knew the weight of a sledge before she lifted it, that it meant something, and that the something was inside the careful part of the wall, and not the rubble. So she made the shack livable first, because a person must eat and sleep before she can think, and because the careful work would still be there when she was ready. She patched the roof with split shakes, she rived herself from a fallen pine, sitting astride the ridgepole in the cold with a froe and a wooden maul splitting the straight-grained wood the way her father had shown her, each shake laid to lap the one below, so the water would run and not stand. She cleared the window of its sacking and scrubbed the frame, and hung an oiled hide over it that let in a brown light by day and held the heat by night. She built a small forge of loose stone outside the door, a waist-high horseshoe of granite with a clay-lined bowl, for she could not work granite without a way to sharpen and draw her tools, and her father had taught her the smith's part of the mason's trade along with the rest. She had no bellows but the leather lungs of an old set she had carried up from St. Louis patched at the seams, and she worked them with one hand while she turned the iron with the other. By the end of the first week, she had a dry place to lie down and a fire to cook over, and a row of chisels and points laid out on a clean board, each one drawn to a fine edge and tempered straw blue in the coals. Pellet the mule had a lean-to of his own against the lee of the cut, and at night she could hear him shift his weight and blow, the only company she had, and the only company she wanted. It was the old man who first told her there had been a death. His name was Ezra Toom, and he lived 2 miles down the creek in a cabin. He had built himself 40 years before, and he came up the track on the 8th day, leading a goat and carrying, of all things, a crock of butter, because he had heard a woman had bought the Quarry shack, and he wanted to see for himself what kind of fool she was. He was past 70, bent like a fence post after a hard winter, with a white beard stained yellow at the chin and eyes that had not gone soft with age. He set the butter on her stoop and looked at the shack a long while, and then he looked at her. "You patched the roof," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said. He grunted. The man who built that place could not have patched a roof to save his life. He was a stone man, not a carpenter, good with rock and useless with everything else. He squinted at the north wall, and something moved across his old face that was not quite grief and not quite fear. "I knew him," he said. "Long time back. His name was Asa Reed." Cora set down the butter crock inside the door and came back and stood beside the old man, and she did not ask the question directly, because she had learned that old men tell more when they are not pushed. She only said, "He did fine work, the lower part of that wall." Ezra Toom was quiet for a moment. "He did," he said at last. "Best mason in the hollow when the quarry was working. He built the company office, and the powder house, and the foreman's chimney, and they all stand yet. Then he built that shack for himself, and he never finished it, and one winter he was gone, and folks said he had run off with company money because a strongbox came up short the same season. He let out a breath that fogged in the cold morning. I never believed it. Asa Reed would no more steal than he would lay a crooked course. Still, a man is not here to defend himself, and a missing box of money speaks louder than a dead man's good name. He did not stay long after that. Before he went, though, he turned at the bend in the track and called back to her, and his voice carried the weight of something he had carried alone a long time. "If you are going to take that wall apart," he said, "you take it down careful. There is more in this hollow than rock." She thought about that all the rest of the day, and through the night, lying on her pallet with the cold coming up through the floor, listening to the spring water run in the cut. A best mason in the hollow, a shack he built for himself and never finished, a wall whose careful courses stopped part way up, as if the builder had been interrupted and never came back. A strong box come up short, and a good man's name buried under it. She did not yet have the shape of it. She had the edges, though, and she had learned from her father that you build toward what you cannot yet see by setting one true stone at a time. In the morning she began to take the wall apart. She did not tear it down. That was the thing the men in the hollow would never have credited, if any of them had bothered to come and watch, which they did not. She did not swing a sledge and pull the courses down in a heap. She took the wall apart, the way her father had taught her to take apart a thing built by a man worth respecting, which is to say, one stone at a time from the top, each block lifted and turned and set aside in the order it had come out, so that the wall lay on the ground in the same sequence it had stood, and so that she could read it as she went. The rubble at the top came away easy and meant nothing. She worked down through it in a single morning, and by noon she had reached the line where the hurried work ended and the careful work began, and there she slowed, because careful work deserves a careful hand. The first thing she noticed was the mortar. There was none anywhere else in the shack. The whole of it was dry-laid, stone on stone. Here, though, in the careful courses, deep in the heart of the wall, where no eye would ever see it, someone had bedded certain stones in a thin lime mortar, just a few of them, a small chamber's worth, set into the thickness of the wall, like a stone within a stone. A man does not mortar the hidden middle of a dry wall by accident. He does it to make a box. He does it to keep something dry, and still for a long time. She stopped working when she found the mortar, and she sat back on her heels in the cold sun, and her heart, which did not move easily, moved then, because she understood what she was looking at. Asa Reed had built a wall around something, and then he had died, or fled, or been driven off, before he could come back for it. And for 11 years it had stood in plain sight at the foot of the cut, a thing the whole hollow walked past and laughed at, and not one of them had ever read the courses. Here I will say a thing my own grandmother used to say, that the world is full of locked rooms, whose keys are lying in plain sight, and that most folk die having never learned to look. Cora had learned. Her father had given her the looking, and the looking was about to give her everything. She worked the mortared chamber loose over 2 more days, and she worked it slow, because the lime had set hard and the stones were keyed together cunningly, and because a single stone broken in haste might break what it guarded. She drew her chisels fine on the forge each morning before the light was good enough to work by, the coals throwing red on her face and the small ring of the hammer carrying down the cut. She learned the chamber the way she would have learned a man's handwriting, tap by tap the iron point set against a joint, and struck once lightly, and her ear told her whether the stone behind it was bedded loose or locked. The careful builder had keyed his stone so that each one held its neighbor, the way the keystone of an arch holds the whole span, and to pull one without loosing the next was to fight the wall instead of reading it. She did not fight it. She tapped where the joints told her to tap, following the grain of the setting the way you follow the grain of a board, and twice she stopped for the better part of an hour, sitting back on her heels, with her hands flat on her knees, because she had felt a stone begin to bind and would not force it. The wall gave its stones up to her one at a time the way it had taken them, and she set each one in the dirt in its order, a long curving line of granite blocks lying in the cold like the vertebrae of some buried thing, until on the third evening, with the light going amber and the cut throwing its long shadow across the shack, she lifted out a flat capstone and saw in the cavity beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff and dark with age, a shape the size of a large book. She did not snatch it. She sat a long moment and looked at it where it lay, the way you look at a thing you have wanted so long that having it frightens you. The air that came up out of the cavity was cool and close, and smelled of lime and old cloth, the breath of a space that had been sealed since before she came to the territory. Then she lifted the bundle out with both hands, and it was heavier than a book, and she carried it to the doorway, where the last of the light fell, and she unwrapped the oilcloth fold by fold. Inside was a ledger, and beneath the ledger, in a second, wrapping a leather wallet of papers, and beneath that, wrapped separately and most carefully of all, a small canvas sack that chinked when she lifted it. She opened the sack last. It held 11 gold double eagles and a scatter of smaller coin, and a folded paper that turned out to be a tally, a careful column of figures in a mason's plain hand, and at the bottom of the column a sum, and beside the sum 3 words. This is theirs. She did not understand the whole of it that night. She understood enough, though, to know that she was holding the thing that 11 years of the Hollow's certainty had been built on top of, and that the certainty was wrong. The ledger was the company's, the granite company that had opened the cut and abandoned it. It was a wage book, bound in cracked black leather with a strap that had gone brittle, and it ran for the last 2 years the quarry worked, and it was kept in 2 hands. The first hand was a clerk's, neat and slanted, the entries ruled into columns with a careful rule. The second hand, entered in the margins and at the foot of many pages, smaller and pressed harder into the paper, was the same plain mason's hand as the tally, Asa Reed's hand. What Asa Reed had written in those margins was a second set of figures that did not match the first. Where the clerk's book said a man named Wills had been paid $9 for a week, Asa's margin said Wills was owed 14 and paid 9. Where the clerk's book showed a crew of 12, Asa's margin named 14 men, and noted that 2 were never entered at all, their wages drawn and never delivered. He had written dates beside the worst of them, and once, beside a week where 4 men had been short paid at once, he had written a single line that was not a figure. They think no one keeps a second book. Page after page, for 2 years, the careful mason had kept a true account beside the false one, in stolen minutes by lamplight, never knowing whether he would live to use it. And the gap between the 2 accounts was a river of money flowing somewhere it did not belong. The leather wallet held the proof of wear. It held letters, folded small and worn soft at the creases, and the letters were signed, and the name signed to them was a name Cora had heard spoken in the Hollow only 11 days before, at the auction, in a sweating man's joke about a strong wind. The freight office. The paper on half the Hollow. Harlan Doak had been the company's paymaster in the years the quarry worked, before the railroad came and the company pulled out and left him holding what he had skimmed, and the letters in the wallet were Doak's own instructions to the clerk, in Doak's own hand, telling him which men to underpay and which to leave off the book entirely, and how to carry the difference so the totals would still answer. Asa Reed had got hold of them somehow. A man who built the company office, Cora thought, who set its hearthstone and hung its door, might well have kept a key to it, or known where the clerk kept his. And having got them, the honest mason had done the only thing an honest man with no power can do against a man with all of it. He had hidden the truth where it would keep and built a wall around it, and meant to bring it out when he had found someone who would listen. He had not lived to find them. The strongbox that came up short, Cora understood now, had come up short because Asa Reed had taken from it exactly the wages Doak had stolen, no more and no less the 11 double eagles and the scatter of coin, and had set them aside to be returned to the men they belonged to. This is theirs. He had not stolen. He had been the only man in the hollow who had not stolen. And he had died with the lie, sitting on his name like a capstone, and the men he meant to repay had gone 11 years short, and never known there was a hand reaching out of the wall to make them whole. Cora sat in the doorway until the cold drove her in, and then she sat by the forge fire, with the ledger open on her knees, and she did a thing she had not done since her father died. She wept, once, briefly, and not for herself. Then she wiped her face and began to read the true account properly, name by name, because if the money was theirs, then she would need to know exactly whose, and exactly how much, and a mason counts true or she does not count at all. It took her a week to make the reckoning. She walked down to Ezra Tomb's cabin on the second day of it and laid the ledger on his table, a plank table worn pale and scrubbed clean, and she turned it to the light of his one window and watched his old hands shake as he turned the pages. She watched him read down the columns slow, his lips moving over the names of men long dead, some of them his own age and some of them younger, men he had worked beside in the cut 40 years gone. She watched him come to the page where his own name was written, Tomb, in the false book page 6, in the true margin ode 11, and watched him put his finger on the figure and hold it there a long time without speaking. The goat bleated somewhere outside. The fire ticked in his stove. He had been one of the cheated men. He had spent 40 years 2 miles down the creek, believing Asa Reed a thief, and grieving the belief, because Asa Reed had been his friend, and a man can carry a grief like that the way he carries a stone in his boot, never quite able to set it down, and never quite able to forget it is there. I called him a thief, the old man said at last, not to her but to the table. To his face I never did, behind his memory I did, 100 times. He closed the ledger gently, the way you close a thing you are afraid of marking. You read the wall, he said, and his voice was not steady. All these years it was sitting up there in the wall, and you are the one who read it. My father taught me how, she said. Then your father, said Ezra Tomb, taught you the only thing worth teaching. Word of a thing like that does not stay in a cabin. By the time Cora had finished her reckoning, the hollow knew that the woman who bought the quarry shack had taken its north wall apart and found the company wage book inside, and that the book had Harlan Doak's hand in it, and the certainty that had laughed at her $11 began, very quietly, to curdle. Men who had worked the cut in the old days came up the track now, the ones still living, and they came not to laugh, but to look. And Cora let each of them read his own name in the true account, and the looking that had once gone past the wall now went straight into it. Gaddis, the surveyor, came too, and stood a long while over the ledger, and being a man who understood that figures are a kind of stone that also remembers how it was set, he said that he would carry word of it down to the territorial court at Helena himself, because what was written in that book was not a rumor a man could laugh off, but a record. And a record is a hard thing to outrun. Harlan Doak did not come up the track. That was the last thing Cora ever learned of him directly, and it was enough. A man who has built his standing in a place on a thing he buried does not go and stand beside it once it has been dug up. The letters in the wallet were in his hand, and there were men still living whose true wages were named beside their marks, and the territory in 1887 was no longer the lawless place it had been when the quarry worked. Gaddis carried the ledger down to Helena, and Cora went with it to swear how she had found it, and the law that followed was slow and made of paper, as the law is, but it moved in one direction only. Doak's freight office changed hands within the year. The paper he held on half the hollow was bought out from under him by men who had read the true account and did not care to owe money to a proven thief. He left the territory before the second snow. Cora never saw his face. She had undone him without once raising her voice, and that, her father would have told her, is the only kind of undoing worth the doing. The law was never the point, though, and the ruin of Harlan Doak was never the thing Cora wanted. What she wanted was written at the bottom of a mason's tally in 3 plain words, and she set herself to it the way she set herself to everything. 1 true stone at a time, she found the men. Some of them were dead, and for those, she found the children. And where there were no children, she found the widows, and where there was no one at all, she set the share aside against the day someone might come asking. The 11 double eagles and the scatter of coin were not enough to pay every man his full back wages, not after 11 years, and Cora knew it, and so she did a thing that the men in the hollow remembered longer than they remembered the wall itself. She took the gold Asa Reed had set aside, and she added to it everything she had, the $40 from her coat hem and the small sums she earned that summer, rebuilding the very chimneys and walls Asa had built, and she paid the reckoning out as far as it would go, in person to each name in the true account or to the kin of each name. With the page of the ledger turned to where they could see their own figure and the date 11 years gone. She did not make a speech when she paid them. She handed over the coin, and she said, "This was owed to you. A man set it aside for you a long time ago, and he could not bring it himself." That was all. The men who took it from her hand were not, most of them, men who wept easily, but more than one of them had to turn away before he could speak, and what they said, when they could speak, was almost always the same. They asked the name of the man who had set it aside, and Cora told them. "Asa Reed," she said. "The mason, the one they said ran off. He never ran. He built it into a wall and waited for someone to read it. There was a widow named Salt, far down the creek, whose husband had been one of the 2 men never entered on the company book at all, and who had been told when he died that the company owed him nothing because the company had no record of him." Cora rode out to her with the page turned to the place where Asa's margin named him, and the woman, who was older than Ezra Toom and nearly blind, would not believe it until Cora guided her finger to the line and read it to her aloud, the name and the figure and the date. The widow Salt did not take the coin at first. She said she had made her peace with the lie 11 years ago, and did not know what to do with the truth so late. Cora told her that a debt did not stop being owed because it had gone unpaid a long time, and that her husband had not been a man with no record, but a man whose record had been hidden in a wall by someone who thought he mattered. The widow took the coin, then she held it in both hands and did not look at it, and she asked Cora to read the line one more time, and Cora did. There was a grown man, gray at the temples, who had been a boy of 12, when his father worked the cut and died still half believing the town's story that his father had thrown in with a thief. He came up the track to the shack and stood a long time at the open chamber in the wall before he could bring himself to speak, and when Cora put the coin and the turned page into his hands, he asked her very quietly whether his father had known. Whether his father had been one of the men Asa Reed kept true count of, or whether he had been part of the taking. Cora showed him the margin. His father's name, the false figure, the true one, and beside it in the mason's plain hand a single word, paid, meaning paid short, meaning wronged. The man read it, and his jaw worked, and he said only that he had spent 30 years ashamed of a thing that had never happened, and Cora said that the shame had been put on him by the same hand that took the wages, and that he could set it down now. He went back down the track, lighter than he came up. She watched him go from the doorway and did not call after him, because some things a person must carry away alone to truly have them. By the time the aspens went gold along the cut, the name of Asa Reed had been turned right side up in the hollow, and the thing that had been a joke about a strong wind had become a different kind of story, the kind that gets told slow in the evening and ends with a silence. Ezratum took it upon himself to see that a proper marker was set where Asa lay, in the company ground above the cut, a flat granite block, that Cora cut and dressed herself, square and true, the joints of the lettering chiseled clean. She chose the stone from the abandoned blocks left half-split in the cut, a piece of the same granite Asa had spent his life working, and she dressed its face over 3 evenings until it was smooth enough to take a fine line. She did not carve a verse on it. She carved his name and the years, and below them 4 words that anyone who knew the story would understand, and anyone who did not would think a strange thing to put on a stone. He built it true. The quarry shack she did not rebuild as it had been. She raised the north wall again from the same stones, but this time she laid every course the way Asa had laid the bottom of it, level and plumb, and the joints properly broken, careful work all the way to the roof line. And she left the hidden chamber empty and open in the heart of it, a small dry hollow the size of a large book, and she set a single flat stone in front of it that could be slid aside. She did not put anything in the chamber. She left it for the looking. Folks who came up the track in later years would ask her why a wall should have a hollow place built into it on purpose, and Cora would slide the stone aside and let them see the emptiness, and she would say only that a wall is a good place to keep a thing you want found if you build it true and you are patient, and if you trust that someone will come along who knows how to read the courses. She lived in the hollow the rest of her long life, and she became in time the mason the territory and then the state sent for when a thing had to be built to last, the courthouse steps in the county seat, the piers of a bridge over the creek, the deep, cool walls of more than one spring house and cellar. She trained 2 apprentices in her years, a girl and a boy, and to each of them on the first day, before she let them lift a single tool, she said the thing her father had said to her on the upturned bucket. Stone remembers how it was set. A wall will tell you who built it if you learn to read the courses. And then she would walk them up to the quarry shack and slide the stone aside and show them the empty hollow in the heart of the north wall, and let them put their own hands into the cool dark of it and feel for themselves the shape of the thing built true and meant to be found. Ezratum died 4 winters after the wall came open, and he died, his neighbors said, easier than a man his age had any right to, because the one wrong that had sat on his old friend's name had been lifted before he went. Pellet the gray mule lived longer than seemed possible for a mule, and died in the lean-to against the lee of the cut. And Cora buried him there and set a small undressed stone over him, not because a mule needs a marker, but because she had carried him a long way and meant to remember it. Gaddis, the surveyor, came back through the hollow now and again on the railroad's business, and he never failed to climb the track and sit a while at the shack, and the 2 of them would talk, as people do who were present together at the one thing in their lives that mattered more than the rest. I have told you this was not a story about a gunfight or a wedding, and it was not. It was a story about a woman who paid $11 for a thing the world had thrown away, and who knew how to read what the world had not bothered to read, and who used what she found not to make herself rich, but to make a dead man honest, and 11 cheated families whole. The men who laughed that morning had looked at the quarry shack and seen a ruin a wind would carry off. Cora looked at the same wall and saw a man's last true account, set in stone and waiting, and the difference between those 2 ways of looking is the whole of the difference between the people who throw things away and the people who pick them up. If you have ever been the one in the room everyone was certain about, the one whose quiet they mistook for nothing, you already know how the rest of the hollow felt the morning the wall came open. Tell me about the thing you saw that no one else thought worth looking at. And if a story like this one sat well with you, there are others of its kind waiting, other women and other walls and other things the world buried and called worthless. The last image is the one Cora herself kept longest, and it is the one I will leave you with. Late in her life, an old woman now, she would walk up the track in the long evening with her father's chisel in her coat pocket, the handle worn smooth by 2 lifetimes of hands, and she would stand in front of the north wall of the quarry shack in the amber light coming off the cut, and she would lay her bare palm flat against the careful courses, the way she had the first morning she ever stood there, and she would feel under her hand the level beds and the broken joints and the plumb-true face of a thing built to last 100 years. And the wall, in the only way a wall can, would tell her again who had built it. It always did, it always would.